Okay, welcome to the second panel that I'm moderating on the CRA. We're changing the lens now. The last panel looked at manufacturing perspective. This perspective is going to be looking at a particular part of CRA, enterprise. So what I would like to do is I'm going to move down the line here, get our panelists to introduce themselves and give us a kind of a view from the enterprise perspective, what CRA means to enterprise. So if I can start with you, Window, if you could start us off, thank you.
Sure. I'm Window Snyder, and I'm the founder and CEO of Thistle Technologies. And prior to starting this company, I was also the CSO, or the CISO, at a number of companies, including Square, Fastly, Mozilla, and I was the Chief Software Security Officer at Intel. In terms of what the Cyber Resiliency Act requirements are going to mean for CISOs, for me as a CISO, trying to manage these completely uninspectable little black boxes on my network, all these devices, was a huge pain. So for being able to have more transparency and also confidence in the update mechanisms being available for these devices, and that there's actually a plan in place for security vulnerability resolution, as a CISO, that would be something that would provide a lot of relief to a pretty significant pain point.
Hi, I'm George Gray. I was employee number 1 and CEO of Linaro, and then founded a company called Foundries.io, which is built SaaS tooling specifically to solve this problem of how do you create a platform that enables tooling to help with securing the life cycle of a product all the way from initial development and choice of components all the way to end of life. In the enterprise, you are faced with a lot of devices, as you say, that are connected to your network. And if those devices are being bought in, the compliance to the CRA is the responsibility of the manufacturer who's selling them to you, but you still need a lot of process in place under the CRA to be cognizant of the fact that there may be vulnerabilities that you discover or that the manufacturers of the products inform you about, and you then have to take action based on that in order to protect your own user base. So there's a lot of implications, not just for the manufacturers of boxes, but also for the devices that you deploy in the enterprise.
Thank you. My name is Michel, Wouters van den Oudenweijer. I always like to name my whole last name, a real Dutch name. I'm 25 years in compliance of radio, EMC, now the Cyber Resilience Act. So a lot of certification, testing. How I see it in the enterprise, the CRA, indeed, there are a lot of products combined in a solution, and they all need to comply on itself to the Cyber Resilience Act. But indeed, if this is complete, installed in a big building or somewhere or in a big company, what happens when you combine all these devices together? It's getting way and way more complex. When one manufacturer is offering a total solution, then for the Cyber Resilience Act, it's very clear. The whole installer will be the manufacturer of his total solution. But how about if you combine all these devices together? It's we still have 2 years, but yeah, that is a lot to think about. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, Michel, and I think to some degree you've already answered it, but let's go with it, and what I'll do is I'll pass it along for more perspectives if that's okay. So the question is, from a solution developer perspective, what steps do you think must be taken to be able to guarantee, if guarantees exist, that is, it's quite a strong word, that the final installation with its interconnected components is cyber resilient and aligned to the requirements of CRA? Michel.
That is a very good question, and because the Cyber Resilience Act is actually it's a product certification, and it's our devices on itself. So at the end, as it is a total system, what would you do? From my perspective, is to first of all check for all the components or you are using in your system is to check if they meet the essential requirements and if the CRA is covered. And how do you do that? By checking all these documents separate if they are available. I think as a final installer, this should be your responsibility. How to check it afterwards? Well, you combine everything together. Then you have a system, and the system itself also need to be audited itself. Are there vulnerabilities? And if there are vulnerabilities, how are we going to fix those vulnerabilities? So step A is first of all the parts you do use, check them if they are compliant. And then in the system, there will be eventually a total system check.
Yeah, I think from an enterprise point of view, there are two aspects. One is if you are creating products yourself, clearly you have a lot of work to do, as we've described in, I think, in the previous session and in other sessions here. In terms of using devices in the enterprise, I mean, to some extent, it's like buying devices that comply with RED or that are ISO 9000 compliant or whatever it is. That's a procurement problem. The other issue that you face is you do need process to deal with the manufacturer ringing up your CISO and saying, you've got a problem because one of our products has a vulnerability. And so you need a process for dealing with that. And most companies who ship products have not secured them today properly. And so you see a lot of devices in enterprises and out in the wild that are not properly secured and that will not meet the requirements of the CRA. So you really also need to do an audit of any devices that you currently have that have been in use for the last 5 years or 10 years and work out, do you want to continue using those or do you want to update? And that's an expensive business.
One of the things that we don't talk a lot about as an industry is how challenging it is to deliver updates to devices. Because for software, for the most part, if you have a vulnerability and you need to ship an update, then a failure rate for update for software is a very different proposition than if you have got a significant failure rate for update for a physical device. So if, let's say you're updating a web browser, I always pick web browsers because I've worked on all of them, literally all of them, and the update fails, the user can, for the most part, try it again or reboot their machine and mostly get back to that known good state. But if we're talking about a phone, a consumer device like a phone, and the update fails at the firmware level, that's a device that has to come back to the shop, has to be flashed with a USB cable. It's a pain. If we're talking about a car, it has to come back to the dealership. If we're talking about industrial manufacturing equipment, it shuts down the line. If we're talking about medical devices, it impacts patient safety. If we're talking about a satellite, that's just gone forever. You're not getting that device back, right? So the requirement for update in terms of reliability is much higher. So what we end up seeing is that device manufacturers, even when they have an update mechanism, it's not a reliable or robust or they don't have enough confidence in that update mechanism to justify actually shipping that update, even when there's a vulnerability out there in the wild, actively being exploited, which is what we see with these cable modem routers that are, we had recently had an FBI report in the US, cable modem routers, hundreds of millions of them out there in the world, that were being actively strung into these bot networks and leveraged for their bandwidth to deploy all kinds of nastiness in the world. And the recommendation from the FBI was to go buy a new one because the manufacturers were not able to ship updates for these devices. If you have 100 million devices out there and you've got a failure rate of 1% and those devices don't come back up, that's a million customers calling up their cable providers saying, oh, my internet's down. And then the solution for those folks is to download an update to a PC, use a cable to flash the firmware of their cable modem. Oh my gosh, it's already like a complete non-starter for most consumers. And oh, by the way, how do they manage to download the firmware update in the first place when they have no internet because internet's down because their cable modem router has been it's just not going to happen. So the recommendation from the FBI to say go buy a new one is not unreasonable, but it's still infuriating as a consumer. And infuriating as a CISO out there in the world when you're dealing with all these different devices that have no management mechanism in common. So even if you do have an update available, the update delivery might be so painful that you end up not being able to do it. And you're hoping that like maybe if I stick it on a separate device network, it'll be it'll mitigate that threat somewhat. But those device networks end up holding all of the devices. And so now the risk of any one of those compromised devices compromising something that you actually care about is pretty significant because you can't have an infinite number of networks for all these devices because they have to interoperate. It's such a challenge there, and it starts with a highly reliable update mechanism that you can actually justify deploying your security updates with.
Okay, I just want to make a few comments on what's already been said. And Michel, when we talked previously about this, and you talk about it, you've talked about the actors that are involved in terms of the CRA, but you've also kind of shone slightly a different terminology on it, the economic operators. And I just wanted to make an observation about that. From the CRA perspective, this is about compliance. This is about certification. IoTSF, we don't really like the term certification because we think it's very limited. We prefer to talk about assurance. This brings in the life cycle dimensions of products and services, and the nature of security. So in terms of safety, you can do pre-market compliance and checks, but with security, it's got to be maintained over life cycle. So we like to engender a security mindset rather than a compliance mindset. However, we have economic operators, and that will be the lowest form. You have to do this, it's mandatory. But my message to people today is we hope that you will adopt a security mindset and not just fall back on the basics of compliance. But I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm coming to you first, George, on this. Again, you bring an awful lot of experience from a kind of a foundational level, software and products. I want to talk a little bit about the edge, and we used to talk about cloud and edge, and I think fog came in at some point. Fog, I was listening to a talk yesterday, and edge has now been, from our friends at IoT Analytics, talk about, I think micro edge, if I remember this right, micro edge, thin edge, and thick edge, which helps to kind of separate what I would think of as fog. But let me get back to the question, because I'm going off track. I realise I am. Can you talk about some of the key challenges that you think affect IoT and edge products for the enterprise? What do you think, George? And I'm going to invite the others to comment.
Well, we can't avoid a discussion like this without talking about AI. So AI at the edge, AI is encompassing everything. You do it in the cloud. It's coming down to the edge for if you're in a car and you don't have the bandwidth or the reactions to be able to deal with it from the cloud. And then it's also coming down to microcontroller devices, right? So actually running tiny models on microcontrollers for sensors. So it's everywhere. And I think to your point earlier, when you think about software and updates, it's no good just being able to securely update your applications. That's not good enough. You have to be able to update all of the software on the device, including the boot firmware itself. Because you don't, any software that the processor boot runs after it's coming out of reset could have vulnerabilities and will have vulnerabilities at some point. And so you have to be able to securely update all of the software on your device. I think in terms of where we are headed on edge and edge AI is more and more processing is coming down to the individual devices. And this is presenting a huge challenge because where we've really said, well, it's a cloud problem, it's now not. It's now all of that processing, all of that workload is moving down to more and more devices. Billions of devices, and therefore the risk of a cyber attack is increasing, which is why this legislation is coming into place, is coming in the first place, because governments realize this is an economic problem and it's a brand problem and it has to be resolved. And the thing about the CRA is no longer optional. Security is no longer optional. It's now mandatory. And the problem is there are not enough security experts in the world. So we need to have this level of security built into tools, built into operating systems, built into platforms that manufacturers can use and enterprises can rely on.
Yeah, it's so as an example, I would like to give the example now for the RED. They have the delegated act and the standards, how to update your devices, how to keep them secure. They talk about secure update mechanisms, secure storage mechanisms. And what they do is they really go in deep into the network assets and the security assets. And by going this deep, there are a lot of tables, a lot of questions we need to answer. You see really that we try everything to get the devices secure. Talking about update mechanisms, you need to go through a whole decision tree, and they were quite, when writing down this standard, actually they think about this quite clearly, how to have a secure update mechanism. We talk about private keys, we talk about public keys. It needs to match each other, that the software, that the devices keep on secure, and it needs to be for the CRA, it needs to be for lifetime, right? It needs to be 5 years or 10 years. Well, actually in enterprise, we don't talk about 5 years. I think the system will be installed for even 10 years. It needs to go deep down, and it's what I would like to finalize. This again, the CRA is on these devices. I think we all agree that the cloud solutions actually do fall outside of the CRA, as they have their own quality system, right? So everyone here, as an economic operator, need to take care of this to get it really secure and really safe.
But part of the challenge, as my colleagues here have brought up, is that not everybody's a security expert. It takes a very long time to build this skill set. So in between, what can we do, right? So leveraging platforms that make it easier to incorporate these kinds of capabilities, that's a fantastic start. Leveraging the kind of communities that we build that help educate developers on how to think about how to evaluate for their project what's appropriate, what sort of investment makes sense, because you can spend infinitely on security, and it might not be the right trade-off for your project. So identifying early on what are your security requirements for your product. How is this going to be deployed? What makes sense, right? Is it like to extract this key from the system? Is it acceptable for the attacker to be able to grab it out of memory? Does it require them being able to take apart the device, decap the chip, reverse engineer the circuitry, and then identify that the key is stored over here? Oh my gosh! And then you only recover one key for that one system. I actually worked on a system for which that was the security requirement. We said that is a tolerable threat. We will tolerate that someone's going to decap the chip and attempt to go through 5 layers before they find the key embedded in hardware. That's fine. But you need to think about these kinds of things, and even learning what questions to ask, right? Where's that key stored? What's the source of entropy? All of this is the sort of work that these security communities attempt to support folks, because if you don't even know which questions to ask, it's hard to evaluate whether any one of these different systems is appropriate for your project, and then what degree of security investment makes sense. Because again, you can spend infinitely trying to make it secure. There is no secure. It's more secure. It's secure against this threat. This threat is specifically mitigated, these kinds of variations on it, and it's subtle. So trying to figure out what kind of investment in time and effort and for engineering this specific project makes sense begins with even identifying what kinds of questions to ask.
Thank you. And I think some of the things that you've just spoken about there, Window, that's what, when we talk about security mindset, those are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about, not just how do I tick the box, and this is how we're going to be secure, because let's not lose sight of the objective here. What we're trying to do is deliver the benefits of IoT, but securely. It's not just about ticking boxes. However, from our perspective at IoTSF, we do see compliance as the position of last resort. We want to be going much further than that. Now, Window, I have a kind of a unique question from you. You come from the US. The regulatory regime in Europe is different from the US. We consider regulation and the bureaucracy that goes with that quite differently. But as a kind of a guest, a very welcome guest into Europe, and by the way, I'm a Brit, but UK is still part of Europe. Just because we're not part of the European Union, we're still European, so I will extend that invitation, so that welcome. Can you give us a perspective, perhaps from as a representative from a US company, thoughts about the regulation, and do you think it's going to be useful? Do you see it as bureaucratic, or do you think it's a necessity as we would advocate? How do you see it?
Well, like all regulations, it has its challenges. I think ultimately it's going to benefit not just the EU, but everybody, because for the most part, device makers who have to incorporate these kinds of capabilities are not going to pull them out for the rest of the markets that they sell their products into. So I think we all benefit, no matter where you're located. And for what it's worth, I've primarily worked on products and companies that have a global footprint or a global perspective, because it's not like the hackers over here stay over here, right? So when you think about threat and you think about risks to these different systems, you're not considering just the local threat environment. It's universal once you connect it to a network. So it's I think in the security research space, in the product security space, it would be strange to think about these things from a regional perspective. It matters when we're talking about the regulatory environment. But again, we work with companies that end up selling their products into multiple markets. So the regulatory environment in one space ends up influencing how those products show up in those other spaces. So I'm happy, as someone who consumes products, that the regulatory environment in Europe is forcing device manufacturers to think about these things, and all these other markets will receive the benefit of that as well.
Yeah, I think if you look back to the GDPR, everybody said it'll never fly. That's just insane. There's too much legislation, and now every country globally has adopted similar privacy practices, especially in the US. And I'm sure you're going to see the same in the US coming out of the CRA. And there's already a lot of work going on in the US to establish similar standards in the United States. So a bit like GDPR, I think the fact that devices need to be secured is no longer in question. The fact that we've allowed it to be optional for so long is a little bit like bolting the stable door after the horse is gone. But we've got to do it now. And if it's being driven by Europe, that's fine, but we're going to have a mixture of standards. The good news is that I think all of these requirements are based on common, it's what are the threat models, what are you trying to stop, and we don't know them all. We're going to find new ones, and therefore we're going to have to provide new updates, again, over the air, or indeed not over the air, maybe remotely. So if you've got an oil refinery that's not connected to the internet for security reasons, you may have to have a secure update mechanism that can actually take an update into a server and then from that server securely deploy it into an environment where you're not on the internet. So there's a lot of things to consider here. But I do think to your original question, EU, US, it doesn't matter. China, everybody is going to be implementing similar standards.
Yeah, now coming from a compliance point of view, I believe United States has now the cyber trust. It's voluntary. Europe is the CRA. We have the Red Delegated Act. Let us hope that we're going to have a harmonized approach over the whole world. Because in Europe, when we have the EN standards, what are we going to get in the United States? Own FCC standards, own KDBs, all around the world. So, yeah, we are now in Europe. We are it's the first one in the Cyber Resilience Act, but let's hope that eventually globally for all the manufacturers and importers or the economic operators, that we find a solution that it's also globally accepted. Otherwise, it's going to be a big barrier. And then we build a big wall, but it also needs to be easy.
Well, the most secure is the answer is that the standard that requires the most security is probably the one that everybody's going to have to implement anyway.
So I'm very conscious that we're out of time. I've got so many notes there we could carry this conversation on. I think what I would like to pick up on just very quickly, and I'm going to ask you, prepare your answer, one key takeaway. You've got to be quick. We're a minute over already. Fragmentation of regulation is a concern that we have in the UK. We know UK government was looking at the potential for doing a regulation around enterprise. We said, don't do that. We've got a thing called CRA that should take care of most of it. It gives everybody a headache. Regulation is hard to do. We do need a certain amount of it, and we need strong regulation. But there, you can have too much of a good thing. So, as I promised, one key takeaway from each of you before we wrap the panel up. Key takeaway from today, Window.
So you might think that we have 2 years to get this done. It takes more than 2 years, especially if you're building these kinds of systems from scratch. So leverage the highly robust mechanisms out there to make this a faster process instead of attempting to go it alone and try and build these things from scratch. Because even though it seems like we have 2 years, first of all, we don't, and then second of all, it takes longer than that anyway.
Yes, I'd echo that. Building secure systems, as I said earlier, there are not enough security experts to go around. So use tooling that's already in place to achieve these goals, because that will save you time, it will save you money, and you're not creating a huge amount of technical debt that you then have to manage for the next 10 years.
Yeah, so from a wireless point of view, and also in regulatory point of view, CRA, start today. Don't pack your suitcase when you arrive at your holiday location. Then you miss a lot of things. And already start, as from today, looking at what are your security assets, what are your network assets. That is really what we also advise wireless IoT builders: security assets, network assets. If you have that already in mind, then you are already a big step ahead.
Okay, to wrap up, the CRA is going to impact everybody. It's going to have a global impact. We think it's quite a good thing, although it's still emerging. We think there's going to be massive unintended consequences. We were discussing over dinner last night some of the implications beyond the products, what it means for businesses and what they're going to have to do. But the good news is, we're making the world more secure. There is help at hand. These guys are around, I think, for the duration. I'm sure they'll be very happy to field any more questions that you have. We're out of time. But if you want to know more, IoT Security Foundation has its annual conference on October the 30th in London. You're all welcome. You can be my guest. Come and talk to me or look at our website and drop me an email. But as we did in the last session, can you join me in the time-honored way to thank our panel? Thank you.